We're going to talk about the National Air and Space Museum located in the National Mall in Washington, D.C. So there wasn't always a museum there. It wasn't until President Harry Truman signed an order in 1948 to preserve historically significant aircraft from World War II and prior. These were all to be kept in metal hangars in Illinois until they could be later on distributed to aerospace museums. So, groundbreaking did not start for the National Air and Space Museum until November 20th, 1972, when they first started construction. It wasn't completed, however, until July 1st, 1976, when it was opened for the U.S. public, just in time for the U.S. bicentennial. So, I wouldn't be able to do the National Air and Space Museum any justice whatsoever if I were to make a video on it, because there's just so much content there. So instead, I took a virtual tour of the Thomas W. Hass We All Fly exhibit. It is one of the newer exhibits, which was opened on October 14th, 2022, and it is part of Gallery 106. It was dedicated to Thomas W. Hass, and the main purpose of this entire exhibit is to highlight the innovation and early pioneers of general aviation. So instead of showing a poorly screen-recorded digital tour, I figured I would go directly to the Smithsonian YouTube channel and get their grand opening video. So, on the left, as you can see, there is an aviator's cap and goggles. Although these are not aircraft, they're still just as extremely important when it comes to the history of general aviation, because those goggles belonged to famous general aviator and military aviator Bernd Balchen. It was stored in a glass cabinet with the greats such as African-American early pilot Dale White, George Noville, Charles Kingsford Smith, and his Balchen's former coworker and co-pilot, Lincoln Ellsworth. Although these are just ordinary goggles and a cap, they have a much deeper story to be told that's not necessarily mentioned through the museum. So, Bernd Balchen, born in Norway, 1899, was a World War I veteran for the Finnish, and later joined the Norwegian Air Corps in 1921, which is where he began his Arctic training. He was later recruited by Admiral Richard Byrd to conduct a second flight for Byrd over the North Pole to Europe. However, Balchen was not the first choice for this expedition. Originally, it was supposed to be famous aviator Floyd Bennett, but he was injured, so he could not conduct this flight. Byrd and Balchen successfully flew over the North Pole in 1929, making history. However, what's not mentioned in the placard that was under the artifact is that Byrd and Balchen famously despised each other. This was due to the fact that Balchen, being a very meticulous logbook keeper and a very, very close to detail man, realized that there were several discrepancies with Admiral Byrd's account for his first ever polar flight. It was later revealed, when Balchen went out and spoke to Floyd Bennett, that they had to divert from their transpolar flight. However, Balchen, knowing that this would have ruined his career and any chance of flying over the North Pole, kept it secret until later on. So here's the placard in the bottom left that was shown under the artifact, and I'm going to fact check it real quick. So the placard claims that the goggles and the headpiece were from a failed trans-Antarctic flight in 1933, yet doesn't really follow it up with any information. So, after some research, it was part of Lincoln Ellsworth's 4-part series to fly over the South Pole successfully and make history. In one expedition from 1933 to 34, a crew including Balchen had to end prematurely due to the fact that the float skis that they had cracked through ice and caused the fuselage to be partially damaged in an ice crevice. So this does hold up. Another piece of historical aviation is the Fulton Amphibian. This is a very unique piece of aviation history. So it was designed by Robert Fulton in 1945, and it was certified by the CAA in 1952. The CAA was a precursor to the Federal Aviation Administration, which was the civil aviation authority. It was meant by Fulton to conquer both the land and sky, which is where the amphibian play on words comes from, meaning like amphibian can live in water and on the ground. And it was a very impressive feat of aviation. So on the left, the placard from the digital tour that I screenshotted shows all the specs of it. And all of these specs completely check out. It had a 34-foot wingspan, 110 mile per hour cruise speed, which is 95 knots, which is pretty standard for early general aviation aircraft. And it had a 7-foot, 8-inch height. It was also manufactured in Danbury, Connecticut, which personally is not that far from my house, back at home. However, one thing that it does highlight on, which is a darn shame, is that despite there being an order for 8 of these models to come out, it failed due to financial investment, not necessarily the fact that there was a flaw with its structural integrity. Furthermore, there are some claims on the placard saying that Fulton logged more than 100,000 hours on this aircraft. However, after some digging, only 25,000 of those hours were logged in the air. The whole point behind this aircraft, for Fulton's idea, was that you could fly into an airport, unlatch 3 separate latches, remove the entire tail section and wings, disconnect the propeller, and then drive the front cabin, which turned into a car, to wherever you wanted in the nearby towns, and then come back, put it back together, and fly home. Which the exhibit does not really mention exactly how this ingenuity worked. So after a little bit of research, I saw that the rudder controlled the back 2 wheels, because it was a 4-wheel configuration, and the rudder controlled it for the braking. The control wheel steered the front 2 wheels for directional control, and it was a single-speed engine with a torque converter and drive shaft system which sent power to the rear wheels through a combined transmission and a differential. Very impressive. This was way ahead of its time, because Fulton wanted to create the first ever flying car. Another piece of historical significance in this exhibit is the 1964 Learjet 23. This is very, very important because the Learjet was one of the first high-speed commercial aircraft meant for business execs. It was a private jet. The placard on the left goes into detail about the hours and the testing and how many flights were required for it. But the most important thing that I saw was that it says that pilots like astronaut Neil Armstrong flew this aircraft. However, one thing that I did have to fact check, which isn't directly false on the museum's end, is that it wasn't the Learjet 23, which might be misleading. It was actually the Learjet 28. The specs of this aircraft, despite only being produced in 1964 for a private commercial business aircraft, was that it had a length of 43 feet 3 inches, had an empty gross weight of 6,150 pounds, total gross weight, of 12,750 pounds, and a top speed of 561 miles an hour. This was incredibly pivotal for the world of private jets because business executives could take this jet and privately fly at a moment's notice to any connections they needed, further uniting the country and international trade. The most important aircraft I saw in this museum is the Cirrus SR-22. This aircraft was introduced to the market in 2003, and it was the first general aviation aircraft to have a glass cockpit. Commonly nowadays, a G1000 and G5 standby are to be integrated, but prior to the SR-22, glass cockpits could only be installed for commercial aircraft or for privately owned general aviation aircraft that had the means to have these glass cockpits installed independently. Before that, all the standard manufactured airplanes still had 6-pack configurations. Another very important feat of this aircraft is it included a ballistic parachute, meaning that in the event of an engine failure, where there's nowhere to land safely, a ballistic chute can be pulled from the ceiling hatch and safely coast the aircraft down to the ground. So to fact check this aircraft based on the stats that the museum provided versus an actual stat sheet from the Cirrus SR-22 POH, we can see that the wingspan claims to be 38 feet 6 inches. However, on the actual stats, it says 38 feet 4 inches. Not entirely sure why, but it's good to know. The length claims that it's 26 feet, which is spot on for the actual information sent out by Cirrus, which corroborates 26 feet. The height says 8 feet 7 inches, but however, it's 8 feet 11 inches. And one thing that kind of corroborates, which I found very impressive, I actually did not know this for a general aviation private aircraft, it has a cruise speed of 211 miles per hour, which, having all my experience mostly in a Piper Archer for my PPL training, I did not know that a small aircraft can go that fast. However, we can see at 183 knots on the actual Cirrus SR-22 datasheet, this corroborates. Another thing that also corroborates is the IO-550N engine, which is shown on the manufacturer, and the 310 horsepower, which corroborates the museum's placard. So you might be wondering, why am I talking so much about the Cirrus SR-22? And that is because this was my first ever experience in the world of general aviation. Growing up, my mother is a flight attendant for Delta Airlines, so we would always, fly to go see family or little vacations here and there. But I didn't really get a taste for general aviation until I stepped foot in a Cirrus at 14 years old. And later on, when I first did my introductory flight to the world of the general aviation, I didn't have a full grasp on it. All I knew was commercial, and this is where I discovered the beauty of general aviation, in the Cirrus SR-22, as seen below. So overall, the Thomas W. Hass We All Fly exhibit at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, it's a very good exhibit, but it's not really the greatest. So let's break it down. It's very easy on the eyes, especially in terms of a digital tour. It's set up very well. A lot of different concepts and craft are in the same room, which has a very simplistic approach, which I personally believe would be very good for children because of how colorful the exhibit is. And I like how it also includes artifacts, not just necessarily aircraft. But the main issue I have with it is that there is a clear lack of information on the placards provided for the artifacts, which required a great deal of research in order to try and fact check everything. So overall, I would give it an 8 out of 10. The only 2 points being deducted because of the lack of clear information. And here are all of my sources.